Welcome everyone to the February edition of the Wildlife Society's webinar series. My name is Maureen Frank and I am the chair this year of the Conservation, Education, and Outreach Working Group. And it is our privilege to get to host this month. And so we're excited to share with you our Faces of Outreach webinar. And we are pretty excited about doing this because we've wanted to do some sort of webinar series for a while. And so TWS doing a webinar series kind of gave us a push to get this started. So as we were thinking about this, we said, you know, we're a group of outreach and education professionals, but a lot of people might not know what that means. Or another thing that I think is great is maybe you're also an outreach and education professional and you're looking for other ideas, you're looking for partners and collaborators, because that's a lot of what we do in this little niche of the wildlife profession. So hopefully this is helpful to you today or educational. And what we're going to do is go through 6 different speakers who are each going to speak very briefly about what they do, the 30,000 foot view of their programs. And hopefully you want to hear more from each of them, because that's exactly what we're going to do in the subsequent months. So at the same time and on the second Tuesday of every month for the next 6 months, we are going to have these speakers come back and each of them will get an hour to share more about their programs. So first up today is Dr. Scott Hingstrom, who is a professor and extension wildlife specialist and the Douglas R. Stevens Endowed Chair in Wildlife for the University of Wisconsin-Madison Extension and the director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife at University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So Dr. Hingstrom, go ahead and turn your camera on and unmute and you're up.
Well, thank you, Maureen. I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk here at this webinar today. And I'd like to thank the organizers from the Wildlife Society and the Conservation Outreach and Education Working Group for putting on this webinar. It gives me the opportunity to speak about one of my favorite topics, and that is extension. Now, I know that not all of you know what extension is or what it's about. And so I thought I'd just, in this short time, give you a bit of a framework about extension. And essentially, it's a system that has successfully conveyed unbiased, research-based information to people and has improved the quality of life of people in the United States for over 100 years. I really didn't anticipate giving a history lesson today, but as I thought about it more, I thought, you know, we have a rich history. And so I should share just a little bit about the history of extension. It starts back in 1862 and later in 1890 with the Morrill Land Grant Acts. And this essentially was, these were acts of Congress in which Congress deeded properties out to essentially for the sale of those properties that led to the development of the land grant colleges and universities across the nation. And the whole intent was to increase the training of our public in agriculture, engineering, and the applied sciences, areas that really hadn't been focused on in years previous to the mid-1800s. And as these land grant institutions developed and prospered, Congress later recognized the need for disseminating information and knowledge gained at the land grant institutions and disseminating that information to farmers, homemakers, and the people of the general public. And so this led to the Smith-Lever Act of Congress in 1914, and ultimately the creation of the Cooperative Extension Service. So there you can get a picture that we've been around quite a long time, and we're widely distributed across the nation through our land grant colleges and universities. And extension itself is all about technology transfer. It's this idea of conveying this unbiased research-based information that has been generated at these institutions and conveying that information out to the public. And over the years, it started associated largely with agriculture. We were a growing nation. That information on different cropping systems, about different crop types to plant, et cetera, and the landscapes, that information had to get out to the public. And so it started with agriculture, but it also was focused on engineering and helping to develop this landscape for the people who were there. Ultimately, it morphed into areas of home and family, consumer sciences, improved health and nutrition among our population. And then it continued to morph into community and economic development and growth and youth. And so Extension kept changing with the changing times. It kept expanding its roles to meet the needs of an expanding public. Extension really was successful because of the development of community partnerships. Across the nation, we have nearly 3,000 local extension offices in our counties across all 50 states. And because of the local nature and grassroots aspect of extension, it really has facilitated communication and cooperation at the local levels. So we've established these extension networks. And by this, I should have started this slide with by this, we start with the agents and the educators. Those are our county-based people. They are our point personnel for public education and technology training. These people, these county agents and educators, they have become local community leaders, and they're looked up to by members of the communities for innovation, information, and assistance. And in addition to that, we have a support group, and that would be our community-based specialists. Most of these are research and extension appointments, and they're the ones who are generating the information, searching for truth, and finding answers that they later then convey to the public through that extension network, through the county agents and educators. Now, extension does change with time, as I mentioned before, and with the advent of the internet, a new entity called e-extension was formed in 2005, and essentially it's an internet-based platform whereby public information or information is available to the public 24/7. And we currently have about 75 communities of practice that are focused on all of these different areas I mentioned previously: agriculture, natural resources, communities, etc. And these communities of practice develop content provided online, available to the public for access at any time. You see 4 focus areas that are listed here, and these were the kind of the initial focus areas of agriculture, natural resources, human health, and youth, but extension has grown widely and has really expanded into a number of different areas, especially in our community and economic development, health, etc. From my perspective, I'm an extension wildlife specialist, and so my specialization is in wildlife. And so I work on game species, non-game species, threatened and endangered species of wildlife, on wildlife habitat management. I work on natural resources policy, human-wildlife conflicts, on youth education, and a wide range of other areas, particularly associated with wildlife. And I have counterparts who do the same in agriculture, in community development, in home economics, family and consumer sciences. How I get about conveying this information to the public is working very closely with county staff, educators, and agents. And I generate publications, generate programs with those county staff, develop workshops, technology training sessions. We develop websites, and we work with the media, and more recently with the social media, to get information out to the public. The last line I have on my slide is associated with the various modalities that we use. And outreach, that kind of classically is perceived as pushing information out. It's kind of a one-way form of communication. And so, for example, websites and videos, pushing information out to the public. But I will say that extension is far more than just outreach. It largely is a game of engagement, of connecting with communities, connecting with individuals, and having a two-way street of communication, of active engagement, of needs assessment, and determining what needs to help improve the quality of people's lives. And that enables us to increase their knowledge and decision-making capacity. In the last few minutes that I have, I just want to mention that within Extension, we have a fallen hero that I want to share with you. Late January 2022 marked the passing of James E. Miller, who was a national program leader for Extension in natural resources. Jim was a beloved mentor and friend of ours, and he will be missed. And I say this because Extension it is made up of people. and it's people that makes extension happen. And Jim was one of our leaders and special people. On June 14th, if the organizers want to continue with me, I've been scheduled to provide a 1-hour session, a webinar session, in which I'll talk more about the variety of extension programs that I've been involved with, especially associated with wildlife. So hope you can put that June 14th on your calendar, and we'll see you then. And to wrap things up, extension, it has been an incredibly successful system over 100 years, in which we've conveyed unbiased research-based information to the public and increased their qualities of life here in North America and beyond. So I appreciate the efforts, and I'm going to pass the baton on to our next speaker.
Great, thank you so much, Scott. And I appreciate the mention of Dr. Miller. You know, a lot of times people will say in the wildlife profession, oh, people get into this because they don't want to work with people, and then you find out that you actually do quite a bit of it. And I think those of us in outreach and education, we actually do want to work with people. So for anyone who's a student and watching, if you really enjoy working with people, this is an amazing profession that has some pretty big heroes that have gone on before to make a difference. So real quick, also, I realized that as y'all saw, I forgot to mention about questions. So if you have any questions for Dr. Hingstrom or any of our other speakers, go ahead and type those into the Q&A. If you try to type them into the chat, they won't get to us. I can chat to you, which is how y'all saw what I was trying to send to Jennifer Summers, who is our question moderator. But go ahead and put them in there, and either the speakers will respond to you directly through the Q&A app, or they will, those questions will be read at the end, especially if you have a question for multiple speakers, then go ahead and share it through there and we'll address it at the end. So next up, we have Dr. Bronson Strickland. Bronson is let's switch the slide. Bronson is the St. John Family Professor of Wildlife Management and Extension Wildlife Specialist for Mississippi State University Extension. Bronson, you are up.
All right, thank you, Maureen, and thank you, Scott. That was really, really wise to have that description of extension and the history and really the background of what we do. And I'll say again, thanks for, mentioning Jim Miller. And thanks to Jim and thanks to Scott of all the leaders that took the time to take me under their wing and educate me about extension and effective programming and so forth. So I guess where I'll start is that when I took this position, I also utilized all what we consider the traditional forms of extension and outreach. And that's usually in the form of face-to-face meetings. And that was really when extension started, was I think the concept of the field day. And that was working with farmers and producers and landowners and taking this technology transfer, this information from the university and how to apply it in the field. And so we did do that, and we continue to do that to this day, because I believe it is one of the single most effective ways to communicate information face to face, whether it be workshops and short courses or field days. And then extension publications are really popular. And beyond that, popular articles, and anyone in extension, if you're in it a year or two, you're going to be asked to be on the radio, then it's going to be TV, and those again are all the traditional forms. What we decided to do, and our first opportunity was with a grant, and we decided to go kind of take it to another level with building a really, really informative website. And it was about wild pigs, and this was 15 or so years ago. Wild pigs were really a hot topic, and once we developed this really expansive type, all-encompassing website, we saw how powerful it was and how much feedback, and we started looking at the page views, and not just in our state or in our region, but literally globally, how much interaction we got. So that then moved to with the MSU Deer Lab, and again, real simply, that's kind of part of my program. I have part of my program devoted to wild pig management, part of it is deer management, and as Scott mentioned, all the other stuff an extension wildlife specialist is confronted with. I sat down with one of my colleagues and I thought, we really need an in-depth extension publication on deer biology and management. And we started crafting this outline, and simultaneous with the feedback we were getting about our wild pig website, we decided to shift. And rather than developing an extension publication and worry about printing costs, et cetera, let's just put that online. Let's just make that a website. And again, it was just reassuring after it was launched, the feedback that we got, the number of people that were reading it, the number of people that were touched by it, it really got me, it gave me the courage probably to step outside of my comfort zone and to embrace these new forms of technology. So after that, we started delving into social media. And good or bad, there certainly is good and bad social media. But I think the point I would like to emphasize is that social media is here to stay. And a lot of the topics that we have to fight as educators, again, some great examples would be what to do about wild pigs, chronic wasting disease. We can't let that conversation be dominated by people on social media that aren't experts. And so we created Facebook accounts, Instagram accounts, Twitter, et cetera, a YouTube channel. And again, it has been a really, really successful form of communication to get information out there. Now, do we educate people and maybe change their behavior to the extent that a totally immersive day-long field day? Probably not. But we get to touch orders of magnitude of more people with this type of information. So I just look at it as it does not replace the traditional form, but it augments those forms, and we can reach more people. And then lastly, a project we've had going for about 3 years is a podcast. And again, very nervous about it at first, but once we decided to do it, we jumped in, and it's been really, really successful. And from that, we got some funding to add more topics and more podcasts to a network that we call Natural Resources University. And so we have a podcast about prescribed fire. We have a podcast about wildlife habitat. We have a podcast about pond and aquatic management. And so we're just reaching more and more people with those different types of technology. And so I guess I would just wrap up by saying that embrace these opportunities, because they're not going to go anywhere. And especially this was significant during COVID and during all the lockdowns, that we really saw our metrics increase and there was no slowdown whatsoever. So we were able to maintain and even do more programming via social media and podcasts during that time. So with that, thank you, and I will pass it along to our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strickland. I think what we're doing today is a fun example of what technology can do, because certainly getting everybody together is something we would have previously only been able to do at the annual conference. So I think that's a neat thing. As a reminder, go ahead and type questions in the Q&A for Dr. Strickland or for Dr. Hingstrom or others as we go. So up next, we have Holly Dentner. Holly is the Natural Resources Communications Specialist for the Missouri Department of Conservation. Holly, you're up.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Maureen. Yes, my name is Holly Dentner. I work for the Missouri Department of Conservation, and my full presentation is scheduled for April 12th. And as you can see, it is titled Trash Pandas and Mountain Lions, What Conservation Communication is Really Like. And just a heads up right now, my presentation is more focused on developing clear, easy to understand messaging, communication planning and strategy, working with the media, and how to tell your story. And that's because I'm not a wildlife biologist. I do not have a science or natural resources background. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in English, and I've been a professional communicator for state government for the last 24 years. I've been at the Missouri Department of Conservation for 7 years. And so my presentation, I'll just kind of give you a quick overview of what that will be, give you some little tidbits, try and entice you to join us on April 12th to learn more. But my presentation is going to cover what a communications professional does for a state conservation agency, how my job is to help you tell the important stories people need to hear about what you do. And so because when you work for a state agency, you don't have to figure all of this stuff out on your own. You have help from people like me. It's a collaboration where you are the subject matter expert and I'm the person who helps you translate your subject so our stakeholders and our taxpayers recognize the value of your work and they want to support you. I'll talk about why communications is important and give you some tips that you can use no matter where you work, state agency or no. I'll also give you an in-depth look into a couple of ongoing efforts by our department, including one that focuses on younger audiences that we are really excited about. So today I'm just going to start out with a little bit of background about the Missouri Department of Conservation. As a state agency, we work to restore, conserve, and regulate Missouri's fish, forests, and wildlife. We are fortunate as a state agency to have a dedicated state sales tax as our funding source. That is rare. Most state agencies, wildlife or conservation agencies, have to rely on permit sales or federal grants and things like that for their funding. As a state agency, we have a very talented and creative group of communicators to support all of the biologists and scientists and foresters and educators who work here. Our communications branch is made up of writers and editors, graphic designers, photographers, media specialists, all sorts of folks whose job it is to help communicate what this agency does and why we do it. When I joined the department, I worked exclusively for our forestry division because we are both the state wildlife agency and the state forestry agency. So it was my job to promote and educate the public on everything from wildfire prevention and forest products to Arbor Day and private land forest management. And then about a year and a half ago, my role changed and I have a broader scope of responsibilities now. So I support communication needs for fish, forest, and wildlife, for our conservation agents who enforce regulations, for the researchers who are in our science branch, and for the people who work with private landowners and community and urban conservation. Now, I am not solely responsible for all of the communication needs of those teams, thank the Lord. That would be a lot, but my work assignments come from those areas, as opposed to say like hunting seasons or trapping regulations, permit sales, that kind of thing. So why is communications important? No matter where you are, no matter what you do, if you can't tell your story, if you can't get people to understand what you do and why, you're going to have a really hard time getting anyone to care about your work or take any action to support it. So that's why when I help my coworkers here at NBC, I always start with asking them about who their audience is. Are you developing something to share with your peers? Is it for a partner organization? What level of understanding will your audience already have about that topic? And if you're working to educate the general public, that's great. But you have to adjust how you talk about the subject to meet people's levels of understanding. So remember, most of the people that we think of as general public are never going to read your research papers. They're probably not even going to understand the abstract. And that's just the way it is. So there are ways that you can adapt. There are ways that you can adjust complicated topics. And it's not just about dumbing things down. It's about being clear and concise and using straightforward language, keeping your sentences short, avoiding jargon, things like that. You also have to resist the temptation. I've experienced that with one of my coworkers just this week. You have to resist the temptation to build your case with a lot of background detail. In my experience, it's best to think of your communication practice in terms of the inverted pyramid style of a newspaper article, where you want to front load your messaging with the most critical information first. And that would hopefully be, what is the ask? What's in it for your audience? What can you lead with that will pull them in and make them want to continue listening or reading or watching or participating? And once you've got them engaged, then you can fill in with all that background and detail. You also have to think about the best way to deliver your message. Do you want to share it with the media through a traditional news release? Is it a Facebook post or an Instagram story? Do you need content for your video's webpage? Are you going to be recording a podcast? Creating handouts, publication videos? What's the best method to share your information? So those are some of the elements that I try to consider when I'm helping my coworkers shape their communication and outreach. And at my presentation in April, I'll go into a lot more detail about that, give you some great examples, give you some examples of things that have worked, some things that don't work, lots of good stuff. And then the final portion of my presentation in April will be a case study about a campaign that we started last summer called Never Lose Touch. We partnered with the Nevada Department of Wildlife and the University of Missouri School of Journalism to focus on how we can be more relevant to college-age people. How can we engage this new generation coming up? How can we connect with them? How can we connect them to conservation? How can we make our work relevant to them? Because they aren't really typically interested in consumptive use activities. So we want to be able to branch out and meet their needs and get them out in nature as well. So the J School at University of Missouri has its own premier full service advertising team of students. And these folks are sharp. They solicit every year, they solicit national clients to help shape campaigns targeted at college students. It's their part of their curriculum to do this. And conservation relevancy for us and for Nevada was their major client in the 2019-2020 school year. So they conducted some primary and secondary research. They developed consumer insights, focus groups, brand strategy, a fully integrated creative and media solutions that any state forest fish wildlife agency could use to reach that 18 to 24-year-old market. They called it excuse me, they called it the youth and young adult market, or YAYAs. So when you see on the screen there how we reach the YAYA audience, that's what we're talking about. People in their late teens, early 20s. So getting all of that data, getting all of that focus group information, getting all of those recommendations for messaging really helped us shape this new Never Lose Touch campaign that we launched. And it focuses on making those 20-somethings nostalgic for memories of enjoying the outdoors when they were younger. It encourages them to get back in touch with nature in whatever way that works best for them. And we're not trying to teach them to hunt. We're not trying to push them to buy permits. We just want them to get outside and enjoy nature in whatever way feels good to them. So if you want to hear, that's my teaser. If you want to hear more about what that campaign looks like, if you want to hear audio, video, see really cool graphics, see how it's going, get some ideas, sign up for my webinar on April 12th. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Holly. I think that's a great picture of the different backgrounds that those of us in education and outreach come from. So that should be a fantastic presentation. Also, I want to take your kayaking class. That looks pretty fun. Next up, we have Gabe Jenkins. Gabe is the Information and Education Division Director for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. Gabe, go ahead.
Thanks, Maureen. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. First off, I'd like to say I'm a professional wildlife biologist by training. I worked in 14 years in the deer and elk program and research for the department, and have moved over to education and outreach over the last 2. So kind of a newcomer to this. Really what I like to do today and in my webinar is highlight the different activities that we here in Kentucky offer through our department. We have a lot of unique characteristics and unique programs that is specific to Kentucky that I think are very different than many other state fish and wildlife agencies. So within the Information and Education Division, we really have 2 segments or 2 different arms of that. We have that support the information, where we have a variety of different things that every agency does, whether it's guides and outdoor education and information sharing, but it's also the education component. And really what I'll focus on today. So, we really have, 5 different key things that I wanted to point out that sets us apart from other state agencies. So one is our Solato Wildlife Education Center. This is an interactive education center that we have on our headquarters campus that has interpretive exhibits and live native animals. We host educational programs and animal enrichments that educate how hunting and fishing, and ultimately how conservation is a tool to over 50,000 people a year. The center is comprised of both indoor and outdoor activities. We have an indoor exhibit that's about 12,000 square feet that has live animals, that has hunting and fishing exhibits, demonstration areas, and fishes. And then outside we have a little over 150-acre compound or campus that's really a living classroom. Of that, about 150 acres, 25 acres really exhibit or show all of our exhibits, our enclosures and demonstration fields. On that campus, we have, the living animals of a bear, multiple bobcats, deer, elk, bison, bald eagle, living stream, quail and their habitat, dragonfly marsh. Everything is native. We have various raptors and owls that we use for public demonstration and education. We have 2 lakes, 4 miles of hiking trails and picnic shelters. So very, almost like a mini zoo, but it's focused on native wildlife, native species that you would have seen and or see now in the state. And then moving forward, one thing that's for sure unique about us is that we have a very large segment of my staff are conservation educators. And those educators have a variety of different roles, and they kind of fall into my next few bullet points here. But specifically, we have 18 full-time educators who work directly in the schools to teach conservation education programs to 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. Now, we visit hundreds of schools all across the Commonwealth every year, and that allows us to interact with anywhere between 60 and 80,000 children year in and year out. We talk about conservation, we talk about species management, we talk about black bears, firearm safety, a variety of different things to these kids that both can be inner city, but also in the rural community. All of the topics that we teach meet the state academic science standards. So the teachers are able to sit back, let us basically teach for them, and it also meets the curriculum that they need to make sure they ensure that they hit for their classroom and their science standards. So, one outreach of our division. And then also those educators then work in the summer at our conservation education camps. So we have 3 summer camps that run across the state. These are 5-day overnight camps that we run for 9 weeks. The same age school children that we go to and see in the schools are the same ones that are eligible to come to these camps. So 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. At full capacity, we can handle about 6,000 kids in the summer. These camps have been around since the 50s and 60s, and it's extremely popular. Pre-COVID, we struggled a little bit to fill our summer camps, but now we have a huge demand and we have a waiting list. So it's really cool to see that increased interest in conservation education, getting these kids out in the field, putting their hands on things. So while they're with us during those 5 days, we teach them fishing and swimming and boating, archery, firearm safety, nature, outdoor survival, and then hunter education. So when you come through that, you'll receive your hunter education card, but all these other different skills. And then we have a patch system where they reach like a expert in all of these things for them to achieve. So very similar to kind of like the 4-H camps, but conservation, fish and wildlife minded. Then we'll kind of segue. One thing that we also have is a TV show. So we call it Kentucky Afield TV. It's the longest running hunting and fishing TV show in the country. We first aired that show in 1953. Our staff are phenomenal at what they do, and I'll have to brag on them because they win Emmys all the time for their production and what they're able to do. They also used to have a radio show. Now they've segued that into a podcast, but it's extremely popular. That's played here in Kentucky, but also in many of our neighboring states. It's a weekly show, and then we're in a little over 7 million households a week on that course or on that show. They're also on demand on all your different social media channels, but like their Facebook page, they have 225,000 followers. Their YouTube is 150,000 subscribers. So it's an amazing resource that, we focus on hunting and fishing, but it's even more than that. It's the conservation stories. It's the efforts our agency is making. It might be a hunt on one episode, then it could be we're out catching elk, or we're on a shocking boat looking at a lake, or we're talking about quail restoration. So it's very different than what you might see on the Outdoor Channel or Sportsman's channels. There is that component, but it's in Kentucky, and it's also, telling the story of restoration species, and then also hopefully getting people engaged and interested to get off the couch and actually go hunting or fishing. And then lastly, I wanted to point out something that's not really unique to us, but a lot of things that go into education is our recruitment, retention, and reactivation branch, or R3 branch. Many of y'all are very familiar with this, and it has a very strong component of education and outreach and all the different facets of that. We have hunter education, of course, but then we have the National Archery in the Schools program. that was started here in Kentucky. That is now in like 48 states, and and hundreds of thousands of kids participate in archery, and that helps for them to take the next step into being archers, to then getting out and participating in hunting. And then really in the recruitment and retention side focused, we offer a variety of different programs like our Field to Fork. Many of y'all are familiar with that. That program was actually started in Kentucky. We were the first ones that developed that, put that out there, and we've now seen that catch all across the country, where people are getting people interested in hunting because of the food aspect of it. And so it's a great program. We also have the Hook and Cook that's a complement of that on the fishing side, and then various other learn to hunt and fish programs that we offer within that branch. So that's really just a highlight of all the education things that we do within my division. I'm going to take a deep dive into some of those, kind of touch on what is successful, what doesn't, program evaluation, different things like that really help us to look at the metrics of what is successful for us and how we change, especially through COVID in that outreach. So, I'd love to see you guys. I'll be on August the 9th, and looking forward to all the different presentations through this webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. You've got a few questions for you, it looks like, in the Q&A. I personally would love to visit your Wildlife Education Center. That sounds pretty cool. And you've got a question from somebody there about that and some of the animals that you have.
Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. Laura Downey. Dr. Downey is the Executive Director for the Kansas Association for Conservation and Environmental Education, which is abbreviated as CASE. Laura, go ahead.
Thanks, Maureen, and thanks to the Wildlife Society for having me here today. I'm happy to be here, and a special shout out to Dr. Sarah Jackson for reaching out to me and recruiting me to share a little bit with you today. I'm taking a slightly different approach than the folks who have come before me. And when Dr. Jackson originally asked me about doing some presentations on outreach, I thought about sort of 9 different strategies that we use as our organization. And so I'm going to give you an example of just how we use one of those strategies in our organization. We are an environmental education organization. We do environmental and conservation education, and we're a statewide nonprofit organization with a really small staff. So we have a whole lot of ground to cover. So we're constantly thinking about how can we do things in ways that help to build capacity for delivering environmental education in our state. And just as a little aside here, we are an affiliate of the North American Association for Environmental Education, and there's an affiliate in every state. So if you're interested in conservation education, connect with your affiliate. And Gabe, we work a lot with the Kentucky affiliate, KAEE, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But when we started out, we started thinking about how do we get environmental education out to the most students in our state, and thinking about our outreach. And our very prime outreach strategy is really about getting other people to deliver the environmental education to students, because we couldn't possibly deliver our environmental education programs to all the students in the state. And so we work a lot with professional development for both formal and informal educators in our state, classroom teachers, and folks who work in places like Gabe's, where it's more of an informal outreach. And we really started thinking about who has an overlapping interest with the work that we do, like which organizations care about environmental or conservation education in the broadest sense. I mean, in the broadest sense. And so we sat down and identified places like conservation districts in our state, zoos, nature centers, even our county farm bureau agents who do some education 4-H, state and regional, state and regional agencies. We thought about who delivers professional development to different audiences, or who has a need for professional development. So we thought about in environmental education, so we thought about early childhood educator, professional development providers. We thought about STEM professional development providers. We thought about places like church and camps and YMCA and boys and girls clubs and scouts, who actually use programming and have a turnover in staff likely every summer that they need to do professional development. We thought about municipal entities like the water department and the parks and recreation department who have a need to do outreach and education. And we really started with that group of very broad folks who we thought had some overlapping interests. And then we started thinking about how do we make a partnership that's mutually beneficial, like what's in it for them. And we, definitely were looking at things like aligning with the mission or the work of the organization or the entity that we were looking to partner with. We were looking at opportunities to expand their offerings so that they could have increased visibility in the work that they're doing. And ultimately, we were looking at how we can also expand and build capacity for organizations like churches and camps and boys and girls clubs with the programs that they offer, because we have some great curriculum materials that they can use in those programs. And then we go around then we went about and we continue to go about establishing connections with those potential partners. And the key to this, as it is with any relationship, is building trust and becoming a trusted partner. And so some of the strategies that we used to do that outreach with these partners were formal in nature, like creating an advisory board and helping bring in folks who we knew had mutual interest to give us advice about how we do the work of our organization. Some of them we've invited to become board members. So like the person who heads up conservation districts in our state has been a board member. We've had board members from Farm Bureau, from city municipalities, all of the kinds of partners that we wanted to work with. And then we've invited them informally to do sort of planning and training and building a plan for how we can work together better. We do it informally as well. We engage a lot in their events. And so this picture is actually me out working with a housing development on a community garden space. And so we helped out with their event, and then they invited us in to do more training with some of their folks and became a trusted partner. We also engaged them in things like our annual conference so that we can start to build those relationships there. And I will just say that it takes time. Sometimes it takes years to get those partnerships built. And I wanted to give you an example of that. We worked with a city municipality that actually does stormwater, and they were really interested in this idea of rain gardens. And so I started showing up at meetings, and they started talking about educational components, and I gave them some consultation and some advice about how to do that and how we could support that effort. And what wound up happening is now a partnership that's been established for almost 15 years. They support us financially every year. They support us with people to come out and help us do different events. We support them by developing some curriculum materials that they need and helping with their education and outreach. And it's an example of what I would consider to be a true mutually beneficial partnership. But that took at least a couple of years to build that partnership to that place. And it did start with us just showing up and being a part of the work that they were doing. And so I think sometimes when we're thinking about how do we build partnerships, it's important for us to think about how we can show up for others and not necessarily what can others do for us. And more recently, we've been working on developing more diverse partnerships. And we recognize that we've been working with a lot of the same folks for a number of years. So we're really working on that initiative. And an example of that is a partnership with a program that provides education to early childhood educators. So that's all they do. And they have a huge outreach with their early childhood educators, and the early childhood educators have a need to get professional learning every single year in order to stay accredited. And what we bring to the table is a new thing for those early childhood educators to be doing with kids, getting them outside, exploring the world around them, and understanding and connecting with nature. So That's sort of an overview of how we use some really strategic partnerships in our organization. And I have 8 more examples of our outreach strategies that I'll be sharing when I do my session on July the 12th. And I think that about covers it for me.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Downey. And our speakers have been so prepared to each announce their own dates. But if anybody missed any of those, our last slide will show all of the dates of all of our speakers. So don't worry. And then those will also be on our webpage. Dr. Downey, I loved that you mentioned partnerships because I think our last presenter has some excellent examples of community partnerships. So last but not least, I would like to introduce Tori Bird. She is the Conservation Action Coordinator at the Hogle Zoo in Salt Lake City, Utah. Tori, go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I apologize, I don't have video today. I could kind of either do audio or video, and I figured hearing me was a little bit more important. Hogle Zoo is really fortunate that we have a physical campus that's open to the public 363 days a year with some pretty unique draws to get people through our gates. I'm pretty sure we're the only place around here where you can come see polar bears and lions. We also have a very large staff with expertise in areas from horticulture to education to animal care and conservation. So this leaves us really well poised for a variety of avenues for outreach. Every day, staff is working on outreach, either on zoo grounds or in our community through classes and community events. I'm going to highlight just a few of these outreach methods here, and we'll take a deeper dive in my follow-up presentation on March 8th. First thing I wanted to talk about was community science, which is a term used to describe research projects conducted in collaboration with the general public and researchers to answer real-world questions. Utah's Hogle Zoo runs several community science programs, as they are a great way to reach out beyond our gates and into our wider community and engage people with meaningful conservation work. Our most robust and long-running community science program is our Boreal toad monitoring, in which our field biologist takes community scientists to the high mountain habitats all around the state of Utah to look for this cryptic and declining species. Those outings range from an afternoon in the Cottonwood Canyons right by the zoo to multi-day camping trips like along the Ponce Plateau near Bryce Canyon National Park. We're also able to provide toad buckets to community members to direct their own toad surveys. These became a very popular option in the last 2 years during pandemic, when we've been unable to have volunteers in our zoo vehicles. Another community science project would be Fraud Watch USA, which was a program run through the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, or AZA, which aimed to teach community members to identify their local amphibians by their calls. This aimed to track the decline of amphibians nationwide. This year, we are launching a community science program called Caterpillars Count, which will be on zoo grounds, and we'll invite zoo guests to spend 5 to 10 minutes during their zoo visit identifying bugs on tree branches, which is a project that aims to look at the decline of birds nationwide. We also participate in the City Nature Challenge for the last several years as part of Team Wasatch, where we host bio blitzes. We also created a Team Hogle Zoo to get staff engaged when we were shut down due to COVID in 2020. Something that we encourage them to get out and do during their shifts. These projects offer varying levels of engagement and time investment, and we aim to have options for a variety of age ranges. One of my favorite projects is our Jordan River Conservation and Restoration Project. And while the zoo supports conservation work around the world, we have found that it can be challenging to effectively communicate about this with zoo guests in the very small amount of time that they're in conversation with staff on zoo grounds. So we find when we're talking about African lion conservation in Niassa, Mozambique, the most common question is, where is Mozambique? And by the time we have explained that Mozambique is a country on the east coast of Africa, we've just started to get into the problems with lion conservation there. And this person's toddler is already halfway across the zoo running towards some bears and they've got to chase them. So we've lost this opportunity to get to the meaningful conservation work that we're doing and ways that we can get people involved. So Several years ago, we started looking for conservation work locally that our guests could be more readily connected with. And a survey revealed to us that 65% of zoo guests lived within 10 miles of the Jordan River or crossed it on their daily commute. This meant that they were already familiar with the river and the challenges it faces. It made it an ideal location to do community outreach and engagement in conservation work. Over the past 3 years, this program has grown to offer at least one event a month. And this year we aim to double that number in most months. It's been a really wonderful way to get people hands-on with conservation work. And we hope that once they're engaged with conservation work in their own community, they'll be more likely to support and invest in conservation work worldwide. We also launched a wildlife camera project along the river in spring of 2020 so that community members could learn about and engage with the wildlife that depends on the river, even if they aren't able to physically be there. The photos from the cameras are sorted by volunteers to remove blank photos or photos where the camera was triggered by something like warm grass blowing in the wind or a thistle growing, so that only the photos with wildlife remain. Those photos are then uploaded to a web-based community science platform called eMammal, where people from anywhere in the world can help to identify them. eMammal has recently had to stop operations, so the project will be moving to a more efficient platform in the coming months. And it's our hope that we can install community science screens on grounds where zoo guests can identify the animals in the photos during their zoo visit. One of the programs that our education department runs is IC, which stands for Informal Science Education Enhancement, and is our main avenue of outreach to school children during the school year. We have several full-time educators who in non-pandemic years spend the school year traveling all around the state to second grade classes, teaching about native wetland and desert habitats. Students analyze an assortment of samples collected by the zoo's fictional research team and make observations and inferences, measure, collect data, and share their results with classmates. For the last 2 years, these programs have been run virtually, which, with as so many things in the last 2 years, has presented opportunities and challenges. Not having to physically travel to schools certainly saves us a lot of time and money, but a lot is lost by not being able to have the students be face-to-face with the animal ambassadors for the class. And this team is very much looking forward to be able to engage face-to-face with students again soon, fingers crossed. And this is just one of the many, many ways that our education department does outreach. Others include summer camps, art classes, teacher trainings, and lots of on-site interpretation. The final part I'm going to talk about today is our Wildware Utah partnership. It's an educational partnership between Utah's Hogle Zoo, Utah Division of Natural Resources, and Utah State University Extension. And it provides Utah residents and visitors with wildlife awareness and safety information. As the human-wildlife interface expands through housing and other developments throughout Utah, our rural areas are becoming much more urbanized. And with outdoor recreation becoming increasingly popular, there is a rise in citizens being concerned about how to recreate safely in these areas. As Utah continues to grow, and as human and wildlife compete for space, we anticipate the number of conflicts will increase. The goal of Wildware Utah Partnership is to create awareness through Utah that will foster new attitudes towards wildlife and motivate behavior changes in people, resulting in minimizing conflicts with Utah wildlife. This is accomplished through both active and passive outreach. We maintain a Wildware Utah website that offers scientifically backed information on local wildlife and recreation. This wildlife went through a big redesign in 2020 and has since won a few design awards. We provide printed educational materials to local field offices and animal control stations. We have messaging on zoo grounds with our native Utah animals, and we host an event at the zoo each year to get guests physically engaged with this messaging in the season where most human-wildlife interactions take place in our state. So these are just a few of the ways that we do outreach and education through the zoo, and I'm very excited to tell you more about it next month.
Thank you, Tori, and thank you to all of our speakers for nailing your very short presentation times that we gave you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Summers, who is one of our board members, and she will be answering she'll be reading out the questions that are written to multiple presenters so that they can unmute and answer.
Hi, thank you, Maureen. Yes, Maureen mentioned, I'm a board member with the working group here, and I'm also work for the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife. So Scott Hingstrom I work with him. So there's a couple of questions that look like or one here that's for everybody. So for Dr. Hingstrom, Dentner, and any others, what is the role of Indigenous partners in wildlife and outreach for your conservation efforts? What should be the role for these partners if not already engaged? In my part of the world, that would be Canada, if I said my jurisdiction has been working for over 100 years to enrich the life of people, then it would be very negatively received by some, especially in light of national efforts towards respecting reconciliation efforts and awareness of the generational trauma placed on Indigenous peoples. In the US, some might say it might be jurisdiction of the BLM, individual tribal agencies, or others, but one argument may be that it is every educator's responsibility to be as inclusive as possible. So that's directed towards Dr. Hingstrom and Dentner in particular, but if anyone else wants to weigh in, that'd be welcome.
Yes, I'd be happy to speak a little bit about this. And I was carrying on a little email conversation while the seminar or the webinar was flowing. And it was from a colleague at Cornell University who kind of pointed out the interesting irony associated with the land grant acts, in that the land grant acts essentially were the taking of lands from Native Americans and then putting them up for auction and sale, or the resources on those lands, that then that money was put into those land grant colleges and universities so that we could benefit the rest of the country, the developing nation. So, this goes a long way back with an interesting history of which we all struggle with in a variety of different ways. Perhaps I can best address this just, personally and currently. One of the things that we've done with extension at University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point is to have 3 seminar series. And this goes back to the whole concept of conveying information from the universities, research-based information. And the seminar series, one is a spring seminar series for the College of Natural Resources. Another one is called Living with Wildlife, that is associated with a class that I teach on living with wildlife. And the last one, the third, is associated with Daniel O. Trainer, who was dean of the college here at the College of Natural Resources at Stevens Point. And all 3 of these seminars, they keep Jennifer very busy because we're coordinating speakers every single semester. And we usually have 4 to 7 speakers every semester that talk about various issues. And the issues have dealt with equity and diversity. They've dealt with fish and wildlife management in the Great Lakes. They've dealt with, just waterfowl management, just a wolf management, a wide range of topics here. But I will say that I've worked to network with the Native American communities, especially here with the Ho-Chunk Nation and with the Ojibwe Nation. And we've had speakers from those nations come to these various seminar series to present various perspectives. And it's not to have them represent the tribal perspective, anything like that. It's to represent their perspective historically, personally, communally, whatever, associated with a particular topic. And so in addition, with our seminar series, since the UW-Stevens Point was built on lands that were historical grounds and of the Native American tribes of the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee, we always acknowledge the Ho-Chunk and Menominee nations for their contributions and the fact that we currently are sitting on their ancestral lands. So we try to handle issues like this with respect. We certainly could do more. And this is one of those things that just grows over time. I think it's kind of a slow burn operation. You need to establish association and meet, which leads to communication, which leads to building trust, which ultimately with trust, you can move mountains. And that's one of those old sayings of extension people, is you need to go through those steps before you can move mountains. And you know, we're still climbing those mountains, trying to get there.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
I would just, this is Holly in Missouri. I would just reflect on what Dr. Hingstrom said, very much in the early stages of really, and as our state agency, of really figuring out how we resolve that. And I was just at a native plant seminar last week at one of our nature centers, and the speaker did a fantastic job of the first couple of minutes of the presentation to talk about the indigenous people who manage these lands before we ever got the chance. And I hope that we can incorporate more of that into the historical information that we share about Missouri and our land management and things like that. But we are definitely in that learning process and moving forward and honestly in baby steps to get there.
Okay, thank you. Did want to ask the panelists this question as well. Somebody had asked, does any of the panelists here, anyone offer any training with citizen science apps like iNaturalist or Nature's Notebook? And does anyone get involved with city nature challenges?
The zoo does partner with organizations around the valley for City Nature Challenge. And the lead on that for us is Utah Museum of Natural History. I know that they have produced training resources in the past. I wasn't able to find them just right now, but I do know that iNaturalist has its own YouTube account, and they produce some training videos from there. So that would be my recommendation on looking for trainings.
All right, thanks so much. If any of the other panelists have thoughts on that, I'll let you go ahead and type them in the Q&A. We were told stay at an hour or else, so I'm going to try to do that as best as possible. And we will conclude with this slide, which has all of our dates for our speakers to do their follow-up talks. So each of our speakers gets an hour to talk about, expand on what they talked about today, and then also to answer more questions that you might have. So we hope you will save these dates and join us in the future. And with that, thank you so much to our speakers for joining us, for keeping it brief, for joining us in the future. And thank you so much to all of the participants for tuning in today, and we appreciate your time.